How did small, highly connected communities form the Jazz Age? Now, in today's modern age, we easily recognize social network analysis as an important part of understanding culture in the world around us. And we can easily see how small groups can have large impacts on the world. However, we tend to undervalue its impact in history, and we do not realize that social network analysis is just as useful for understanding history as it is for understanding today's modern world. For the Roaring Twenties, for example, they are remembered as an era of dramatic social and aesthetic change. But this was built by a small group of creative people. We can see this in three main ways. First, and in three main locations as well. First, in Paris with the Lost Generation. Secondly, in London with the Bright Young People. And lastly, in Berlin with the Bauhaus Modernism movement. Let's start by looking at Paris and how the small American community in Paris became a tremendous force for the Jazz Age. So, to understand why Paris became such a major place for development of the Jazz Age, we have to understand why there were so many Americans there, because there were a lot of Americans in Paris during the 1920s. And we have to remember that during the 1920s, the American stock market was flourishing. Everybody was well off and was quite rich. And although we generally know that, we don't apply it to Paris. But what happened was, a large number of generally young men lost from the aftermath of the war, went to Paris after their new riches, generally living off their parents, and moved to Paris. Why did they choose Paris? Well, France had made a very terrible economic decision of overinvesting into gold. Now, the gold standard is a much more complex economic issue than I can go into right now. But long story short, France had made some poor decisions that would go on to effectively cause World War II. But for the time being, it made Paris and the rest of France a very cheap and affordable place to live. And so the Americans coming over went there, and after some went, more went to Paris because there were already Americans there. Because throughout all of France, and including in Paris, they felt out of place. And so being able to meet up with other Americans for fellowship was a major part of the reason they went there. And so they would meet at different places, such as the Shakespeare and Company store, or at other times in houses like that of Gertrude Stein. Now, Gertrude Stein is a very interesting person for many reasons, some of which are too long to tell about right now. Beyond being a major member of the Dadaist movement, she hosted parties in Paris, where she lived at the time, for Americans that had recently moved over. Her hospitality made her home an important meeting place for creative Americans. And these Americans that had come over rewarded her generosity by giving her gifts of art, which made her house more valuable and a more important meeting place simultaneously. As a result, meeting places like her house or the Shakespeare and Company were a major place where the small American communities in Paris were able to change and innovate in society to bring about the Jazz Age. And perhaps this hospitality can be best summarized up by the sign on the Shakespeare and Company store. Be not inhospitable to strangers, lest they be angels in disguise. End quote. But Paris was far from the only place where we can see small, highly connected communities bringing about major social change. Another one of these places is London, and we see this through the bright young people. Now, the bright young people were an aristocratic neoclassicist movement that was fairly exclusive. They also were somewhat exceptional. They threw huge or fancy dress parties, went on treasure hunts through London at night, consumed large amounts of drugs and alcohol, and more importantly, they were loved by journalists. Why were they loved by journalists? Well, because they brought about celebrity culture. Now, before the 1920s and the bright young people, celebrity culture wasn't really a thing. You might, of course, know about some politicians or other important people bringing change, but there wasn't just, the celebrity wasn't a status at that time. But with the bright young people, they basically became the new celebrity status because it was easy enough for journalists to write about their many, many eccentric activities and report about them. And perhaps we can best see this through the lives of the Mitford sisters. Now, the Mitford sisters are comparable to the modern day Kardashians, if some of the Kardashians supported Hitler. But they were all very rich, very well known, and some of them didn't really seem to do much of anything, but they were all immensely popular in their time simply because they were celebrities. Nancy, for example, wrote novels and biographies for a living and while lived in France for much of her life. Like most of her siblings, she was married to multiple rich people. The second daughter, Camilla, was often referred to as woman, and after divorcing a millionaire pharmacist, she ended up spending the rest of her life with an Italian horsewoman. And then Diana, the third sister, is where things get a little bit more interesting. She was a fascist and a supporter of Hitler, majorly. And in one of the biggest scandals of the time, she left her husband for a British fascist named Sir Oswald Mosley. He was the leader of the fascist party in Britain at the time. So this fourth daughter was named Unity Valkyrie, and despite her amazing name, she lived the shortest. And this was because when she heard Britain was declaring war on Germany, she shot herself in the head and died several years later due to complications from this. Well, why would she do that? Well, like her sister Diana, she was a fierce supporter of Hitler, and hearing that her country was going to war against him was something she couldn't live with. The next daughter was named Jessica, and she spent much of her time as a member of the American Communist Party. She had many other eccentric behaviors which are too much to go into right now. And the last daughter, Deborah, was a writer, and although nothing as fanciful as her siblings might have occurred, through all these sisters and their celebrity status made them well known throughout their time. In summary, Evelyn Waugh puts it best. There was between the wars a society, cosmopolitan, sympathetic to the arts, well-mannered, and above all ornamental, even to the eccentric. End quote. They did not care about as much what other people thought of them, but they most certainly cared that other people did think about them. And as a result, society was completely transformed by the bright young people in London. And the last place we see the Jazz Age being developed by these small, interconnected communities is in Berlin, with the rise of the Bauhaus movement. Now, even though the Nazi Party largely suppressed the Jazz Age movements in Germany, this does not at all mean it was small or unimpactful. For example, Hitler had his own jazz band, which regardless of whether or not it is good, is a major point that shows how important this was. But perhaps more importantly, we can look at the Bauhaus movement, and their focus was on architecture, and it totally transformed modern aesthetics. They focused on a relationship between art, society, and technology. And as Walter Gropius, a member of this group, said, the ultimate aim of art, of all artistic activity, is building, end quote. And to prove this, we can, it's rather than giving you examples of what the Bauhaus movement brought in architecture, it would be much easier to give non-examples, because almost everything has at least some aspect of the Bauhaus architecture movement in it. It was so widespread that it's hard to explain what they did today, simply because they did so much to transform architecture in Germany and throughout the world during the Jazz Age. In conclusion, from Paris with and the Lost Generation, London and the Bright Young People, to Berlin and the Bauhaus modernism, small interconnected communities dramatically transformed the world. Without them, we would not have many great works of art and literature from Paris. We would not have the celebrity culture, good or bad, that we do today, and modern architecture would look completely different. Social network analysis plays a major role in history, as it does today.